Welcome to episode 4 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is Senator Bob Day. Bob was one of Australia's most successful builders, growing his business over 40 years into a thriving national company that helped thousands of Australians achieve the dream of home ownership. After being named South Australian Entrepreneur of the Year and receiving an Order of Australia for his housing affordability advocacy, Bob's journey led him to the Senate. Ever since, he has been arguing and advocating for Australians to be given more freedom to decide their own workplace arrangements and for government to get out of the way of, among other things, housing development. I was privileged to have Bob share with me a true insider's perspective on the real challenges in Australian politics, particularly pertaining to workplace and housing laws. Mr. Bob Day, what an honour and a pleasure it is to be talking to you, sir. Thank you for taking the time.
Good evening. Good to talk to you, Damon.
Thanks, Bob. Now, the topic I wanted to get to today, I know you're a busy man and we only have limited time, but you've written quite extensively on employment. And in fact, your most recent article for Liberty Itch that was published very recently, a couple of days ago, it touches on the employment situation in Australia as well. Now, in one of your articles that I've read, you talked about the workplace superhighway. So can you please give an overview, a synopsis of what the theory was about the workplace superhighway that you were talking about?
Yes, it was kind of a practical approach to see how do we overcome and get through these barriers to entry that have built up over 100 years. As we know, systems and regulations are developed and put in place through lobbying by what's been called rent seekers, people who have an interest in controlling the flow of products or services or labour or whatever. And over the last 100 years in Australia, we've had unions and others standing in the way and creating barriers to entry and creating this massive legal edifice called the centralised wage fixing system, which goes back 100 years. Now, one might sort of think, okay, how do we break through these barriers? How do we try to dismantle the barriers? And basically, I've discovered from being both a public servant for a number of years and then being a politician and also being an employee and an independent contractor that you can't break through. They have created so many defenses and moats. And in fact, I wrote a booklet a number of years ago, which I called Checkpoint Charlie. And I used the kind of metaphor or analogy of that infamous border crossing between the old East and West Germany called Checkpoint Charlie, which involved brick walls and barbed wire and mines and all sorts of
armed snipers,
barriers to. And I cited or suggested that the barriers to entry to employment for some people is every bit as onerous as that infamous Checkpoint Charlie. And I came to the conclusion that you can never break through. In fact, those who mount the barricades and are able to sort of control the flow of goods and services and labour have got great skills that they've built up over years. So you can't break through. You have to break with. You can't break through them. You kind of have to leave things in place and say, okay, if you want to change this system, you have to break with it. And hence I came up with this idea that, look, for those who like being in the regulated labour market, the centralised wage fixing system with all its awards and award rates and holiday pays and long service leave, thousands and thousands of pages of workplace regulation. Those who like that, not just employees, but employers as well. There are a lot of employers who like being told what to do and sort of conforming to the regulatory system. But there are a lot who don't. Now, there are those in what I call the middle lane. So with three lanes on the workforce superhighway, the first lane is the old
The
regulatory
Higgins
system.
lane.
Yeah,
Yep.
the Henry Bourne Higgins, the founder and of the workplace regulation system, and that is where most people, are paid award rates and employers and all that sort of stuff, and HR departments and so on. Then there's another sort of more sophisticated and a bit less regulatory system for those who are in the upper echelon, shall we say, the upper executives that have employment contracts, and they're kind of above the thresholds within the workplace relations system, and they're on annual contracts and those sorts of things. But then there's another lane which I suggest is the super fast lane of independent contracting. Those who want to do their own thing, those who want to opt out of the workplace relations system entirely, and for whatever reason, and for good reason or bad reason or no reason at all, they want to do their own thing. And I'm thinking of lots of examples. For example, you might have a young person who lives at home, rent free, drives his or her mum's car, can walk to work, and is getting like $5 or $10 an hour on the dole or less. And there's an opportunity up the road at a local cafe, um, and this young person's cost of living is very low, and they want to break into an industry. It might be a motor mechanic shop, or it could be a cafe, or something that they want to do themselves. And they knock on the door and say, "Look, I live around the corner. I want to do this. I'm unemployed. I'm happy to work for $20 or 10 or 20, whatever it is, an hour." And the employer,
Less
the
than
business
the
owner says, "I'm sorry,
minimum award wage.
it's against the law for me to offer it. It's
Yeah.
against the law for you to accept. I'm sorry, you have to stay on the dole." Now, to me, that is not only just economically foolish, because then you're paying unemployment benefits, you're denying that person the right to get their first rung on the employment ladder. It's also immoral, because what gives anyone the right to prevent someone else for doing for their own reasons. Now, you can actually have got some
Yeah.
you know uh, more bigger picture examples of that in the Adelaide Hills, not far from where I live. There's a small town called Lobethal, and Lobethal had a factory called the Onkaparinga Woolen Mills. You may have heard of Onkaparinga blankets and towels and sheets and so on. Well, they were made
I
in this
have
little
one
town
actually.
called,
Yeah. I
there you go.
yeah.
Well, they were made in a little
Yeah.
town near me called Lobethal. And people worked in the local factory. They lived in the town. They lived in a company house. They shopped at the company store. They walked to work. And it's the most idyllic, beautiful little town. They have Christmas. They're famous for their Christmas lights these days, not their
Okay.
woolen mill factory. And people had this absolutely idyllic arrangement where they could, have an extremely low cost of living, walk to work, and so on and so forth. But of course, the trade off was that the wages were lower than the national average, but that was a good trade off. Their standard of living was extremely high, their quality of life was high, and that's all that mattered to them. Well, along came the unions and centralised wage fixings and so on, and awards, and said, no, you have to pay factory workers in at Lobethal the same as factory workers in Melbourne or Sydney or wherever. And they said, well, if we do that, of course, it's not viable. We'll have to close the factory. And of course, as we know, that's exactly what they do, because it's more important to keep control of the flow of labour than it is to let people live their own lives. So that Onkaparinga woolen mill factory is still there. It's still, but not operating as a factory anymore, of course, you know, as all
Because
these
just can't
old
afford to.
factories go by the wayside. Now, you could multiply that kind of arrangement. I'll give you another example. I knew a guy who had some McDonald's stores in a not so flash part of town, of outer suburbs, a little bit dodgy. And most of the young people that worked there obviously were locals, And these young people, he used to tell me, were not all that reliable, were not all that well presented. Um, you
Yeah,
know, um, didn't, dropped out of school fairly early, but the wage rate was $4 an hour, and they were gainfully employed. Well, along
yeah,
comes the unions again and workplace regulation and said, no, 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 this is far too low. They have to be now $8 an hour. And they said, well, that's ridiculous. So the award rate increased substantially. And guess what happened? The college kids
they lost their
from a little
jobs.
bit further out started to apply for the jobs. And these college young people were very smartly dressed and articulate and good looking, and their mums and dads would drop them off and pick them up in a BMW, and the reliability was much so. Guess what? All the poor kids from the area lost their jobs, and all the college kids got the jobs. Now, call me old fashioned, Damon, but that is not only economically stupid. Again, it's morally, it's morally indefensible. So there are those sorts of examples. In that article with Liberty Itch, I
Yeah,
cited the old case of the stockman, the Aboriginal stockman, who again, similar, were put out of work because it didn't meet the acceptable workplace award rate standard, and the case was brought by the unions, but the government, the Commonwealth government, intervened and put its two bobs worth in and said, well, we support the application of award rates for Aboriginal stockmen, and if, like the pastoralists contend, that all these Aboriginal stockmen lose their jobs because of the pay, well, they can always go on welfare, and we can look after them. Now, so up until then,
unbelievable. Yeah,
Aboriginal stock, when I've worked on Aboriginal communities, and let me tell you, they were highly regarded, they were skillful, they had a whole lot of skills, and sit down money, and the kind of problems that we see now amongst Aboriginal communities was unknown back in those days. So there's just a few examples of not only the
interesting, isn't it?
economic insanity of it, but just the blatant moral indefensibility of it all. But as I say, don't get me
My
started on
understanding
this
is
topic.
that the my understanding of the minimum wage was that it was originally created by a group of people who wanted to price out the lower socioeconomic and educated classes in society by putting a minimum wage in place. It was never put in place to bring up the living wage as it is now spoken about. It was actually done to keep the lower classes out of gainful employment by making it too expensive and not economically viable to hire these people. And the competitive advantage that those people were having, that was a threat upon the people who were a slight class above, was that they would work for cheaper, and that would allow them to enter the workplace, which then gave them the opportunity to rise up, as per their skill level increasing and their proven work
Well,
ethic
again,
showing. So
it all comes back to this patronising, top-down view that we know what's best for you. These so-called, all
yeah,
right,
better
let's
than
give
you
them
do.
let's suggest that they were well-meaning, that they did want. We do know what's best for you. We're only acting in your best interests. We don't want you to be exploited. All these kinds of things, which um, may or may not be true, but the bottom line is all that does is put people out of work, and it takes away an individual's agency to be able to decide for themselves. And it's this patronizing, paternalistic approach to other people, which they just can't abide the idea that people know better than they do what's best for
Hmm.
themselves and their families. I mean, the car manufacturing industry in Australia, Adelaide had a huge car manufacturing. We had three car
Yeah.
manufacturing plants in Adelaide at one stage, and I just it got so bad after with the costs there. For example, that you know people working on the production line, we're earning $100,000 a year now. Okay. That's fine. But my point is, if somebody walked in who was unemployed and said to the factory owner, said to General Motors, how much are you paying those people to put those seats in those cars on the production line? And the owner said, "Oh, 100,000." He says, "Well, I'll do it for 50,000."
Sure.
All
Yep.
hell would break
You're
loose.
not allowed to. Yeah.
You're not allowed to. He said, "Well, I'm unemployed. I'm getting, $10,000, $15,000 a year on the dole. I'd love to work here. I only live around the corner. I mean, the Holden's factory was in Elizabeth, which is a well-known kind of, outer suburb, which was established for
Mm.
kind of, first home buyers and migrants, and you know for entry level, for lower socio-economic and so on. So the factory was out there. People could walk to work or ride a bike. But no, they knew best, and I mean, the examples are too numerous to
They're too,
mention.
yeah, that's, yeah,
Yeah, but that was
exactly.
basically
So,
the gist of
but
it. I
what
mean,
then would you say to, obviously, sorry, what would you say to those who would argue that the unemployment rate is circa 5% at the moment, the unemployment rate, and therefore everything's just fine and employment has, it's all working out and the employees are being treated fairly and companies have no problem doing it because there's almost full employment?
Well,
What would
there's
you say to
almost. I
that?
mean, they know how to doctor the figures. If you work 1 hour a week, you're
They
considered
do
employed.
indeed, yeah.
So there's not only the unemployment rate, which is doctored. It's the unemployment rate is a lot higher than 4% or whatever they're suggesting it is now. And then there's the underemployment rate. But there again, that's immaterial. It goes to the heart of what gives anyone the right to prevent someone from going to get a job. I don't care whether the unemployment rate is 1%. If one person can't provide for their family because they're not allowed to go and work under terms and conditions which suit them, then straight away we've got a problem. I mean, the people making these
Mm.
rules, they don't mind applying a double standard. They all live in a house somewhere. And whenever they want to get their lawns mowed or their gutters cleaned out, they'll get 3 quotes and say, "How much will you charge me to mow my lawn?" Or "How much will you charge me to clean out
And
my
choose the
gutters?"
lowest one.
And someone might quote them
Yeah.
$200 or what. They can take the cheapest. But then they go to work and someone walks in and says, "How much are you paying those people to put those seats in those cars?" And someone says, "Well, I'll do it for 50." And they say, "Oh, that's against the law." I said, "Well, hang on.
$100,000.
I'm the
Yeah.
guy that came around to your house last week and you beat me down on how much
That's right.
you wanted to pay me to mow your lawn or clean your gutters. And now you're telling me that I can't work for 3 times that amount because it doesn't suit your purposes." So look, the whole it's not only is it economically,
Morally, it's
you know,
wrong.
it's morally
And
and it's just
economically.
logically
Yeah.
wrong. And of course, we know what happens. It causes industries to close down. It distorts the economy and all sorts of things. It causes so many problems that it's too numerous to
Yeah.
mention.
Well, yes. As a
It's the
small
old rights
business
at
owner,
work.
I can
They
give,
fought
yeah, as a small
they
business
fought an
owner, I can give
election
multiple
against John
examples.
Howard in 19, yeah. In 2007, we had a federal election, and the motto was "Your rights at work." And
I
Kevin
remember
oh
that. Yeah.
07, won that election with this mantra by the unions of, championing your rights at work. No one champions your rights to work. No one says, well, what rights do people
Well,
have to work, and so on.
no.
Yeah.
But the Labor government just recently, my understanding is, and I haven't been following this. I must be honest, not being in Australia anymore, partly because of the workplace laws. Labor has just made it more difficult for a normal contractor. You had your 3 lanes of your superhighway. There's the traditional heavily regulated lane whereby employers pay 2 to 3 times what the employee actually receives at the end of the day. And so everyone gets screwed. Then you've got your middle lane for your executive types who do multi-year contracts and get options, etc., but have the advantage of not being in the super regulated lane, so they're able to get much better conditions for themselves and the company. And then you have the 3rd lane, which is a growingly important lane, which is just the free contractors, the guys who mow the lawns and do jobs like that around there. And my understanding is there's some new laws that have just gone into place that have made that even more almost combine the Higgins and the contractor lanes
Yeah, well, they'll do
into
anything
one,
because it
turn one
shows
into a
them up.
bus lane.
Absolutely, they'll do anything because that's the threat to them. Independent contractors, they now deem them to be employees for the purposes of the Workplace Relations Act. So, Uber drivers
How does that work?
or fast food delivery people and so on, Uber Eats and those sorts of things, they're trying to deem them to be employees because they are the threat. Like they say, this workplace regulation system we've had in place for more than 100 years, it's a bit like a huge dam wall, and going in and try and blasting it out, with bomb is not going to work. The way to bring the dam wall down is to drill a hole in it. It's the old dike principle. Don't try and bomb the dike. Just drill a hole in it. And they see that independent contracting are like little holes in the dike, in the dam wall. And they see it as a threat to their control and their power. I mean, the bizarre nature of the minimum wage. I mean, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in Australia who are volunteers. They work 40 hours a week in op shops and at the RSPCA, in animal kennels, at Meals on Wheels. We all know them, and they're working 30 and 40 hours of work for free, for nothing, for zero. And we think, oh, that's wonderful that they're working for nothing. And then the minimum wage is like $800 a week. And you say, well, I can't afford to work for nothing,
Surely there's
but
a
I
step
don't
before.
need 800. I mean, pay me 400 and I'll be happy. And again, all hell breaks loose. They say, oh, you can't have that. So, well, hang on. Can I go and work for them for nothing? Oh, yeah, you can do that. Well, hang on. If I can work for nothing,
Yes.
why can't I work for $400?
Why can't I work for a little bit?
Threat to
Yeah.
their system. So the logic of it all just, as we know, it's
yeah.
There again, it's that old.
Obviously,
you
preaching
would
to
have
the
heard
choir,
of
so it's.
Yeah. Well, look. It stems from the old Baptist and bootleggers phenomenon. Have you heard of the Baptist and bootleggers phenomenon, Damon? What it is,
I've heard
it
of the
started
bootleggers,
back
but
in
not the Baptist and bootleggers.
Baptist. Oh well, it started back in the Prohibition days in the United States when it was actually the Baptists that were lobbying on a moral course to ban alcohol because it was, the evil drink and it was destroying families and all these sorts of things. And of course, the bootleggers, were egging them on and also paying the politicians and funding covertly the Baptist campaigns to keep the ban up on alcohol because they were making so much money. So when you get this kind of combination of a moral cause, it's a bit like we have now with the environmentalists and renewable energy merchants. You've got a moral cause
which is heavily funded by the oil companies. They've been in it since day one.
Exactly. Yeah. And the politicians' campaigns are funded as well by them, but they can stand up and put their hand on their heart and say, oh, yes, we're going to keep up the ban on alcohol because it's destroying families, all the while taking kickbacks from the bootleggers. Yeah. Now, you're seeing the renewable energy merchants as well. They're doing exactly the same. They make so much money from these wind turbines and so on that they can fund all sorts of moral causes, environmentalists that talk about the environment and climate change and CO2 emissions, but really these renewable energy companies are actually they're the bootleggers. They are funding these campaigns, and it's a very powerful combination to have a moral champion, what we call the Baptist or the greenies or town planners. They're everywhere. Pharmaceutical, medical, they're everywhere. The pharmaceutical companies are the bootleggers, and yet they've got, the health sector, which are the moral, Baptists that are pushing these things. So it's very hard to break through because they've got a lot of money that they know how, and they've got a playbook. They just turn to page 37, and if some, young senator pops his head up and says, or an MP and said, oh, this is not right, they just go into full attack mode and
stick in carrot mode.
And
yeah.
Oh yeah.
stick and carrot,
They
because
do,
here's the
know
bag
how
of money and here's the gun. So it's sort of like, you can take the bag of money or we can shoot you. Which would you rather it be?
or we'll drive you out of office. We'll campaign against you. We'll tell everybody that you're an environmental vandal, and they campaign in front of their electorate office. And the newly minted MP thinks, "Hey, hang on a minute, I didn't get elected to, to serve one term, and I don't need this fight." And so they quietly toe the party line
buckle.
and just go along with it. Anyway, that's
You
you see that
that
everywhere. Normally, everywhere.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you more about that one day, but
Sure.
for right now,
look, they're everywhere.
I think you've sort of answered it already, but obviously the moral argument for the wage fixing racket is that it's going to lead to exploitation of the workers, which is kind of an unfathomable concept in the competitive business world of today. To my way of thinking, it's so damn difficult to make a business work that the idea that you're going to try to rip off your staff when you need the best damn quality staff you can possibly find at any cost is but
what they do. They further this by they tried to portray employment as a kind of football match, and they say we got employers on one team and the employees on the other, which we are there to defend the interests of employees, and in the middle we've got an umpire who's the Industrial Relations Commission, and they try to portray this as the employers pitted against the employees, and an independent umpire called the Industrial Relations Commission in the middle. That's not how.
It's not even.
You stop for a moment to think that is not how it works at all, because what you have is thousands of businesses with employers and employees on one team competing with employers and employees down the road who are both trying to sell a similar product. And it's got nothing to do whatsoever with the employers versus the employees. They're actually on the same team in each company. And a good example of this was a number of years ago. There was a company in Melbourne called Dollar Sweets. They made confectioners. They made hundreds and thousands, the little sweets that go on cakes and so on, that sort of thing. Anyway, the owner of the business is a guy called Fred Stouter, and he'd had enough of the unions dictating how he should run his factory. So he wanted to do a deal with his own employees. Well, the union started to picket his factory, wouldn't let goods in and out and all that sort of stuff. And this became quite an issue. And so a number of people, supporters of Fred's, went around to the other confectionery companies in Melbourne and said, "Look, you've seen what's happening to Fred. They'll come after you next. We've got a fighting fund to support Fred to fight off this battle." And they all said, "Well, why should we support Fred? If he goes under, that's more business for us."
Yeah.
And that's exactly right, because, it wasn't all Fred as an employer and the other guy who's an employer up the road against the workers. It was Fred and his employees against the other confectioner up the road with his employees. And this idea that it's just a kind of a
vested
game,
interest in him failing. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a false narrative, which, they perpetuate the myth that it's a game when it's not. Anyway,
it's interesting. It's something that's come up a lot on in the other discussions I've had for the Liberty Edge podcast, which is this concept of using government to create effective monopolies by larger companies. So they basically use regulation to build fences around them so that nobody else can enter their space, because nobody else can actually navigate through the regulation which that company helped write and form and put in place for its own protection, even though it looks from the outside like it's something that's a burden to them and a problem. What it actually does is it's a moat around them and defends them. And that's certainly something that I think small business simply can't possibly afford or navigate the workplace laws anymore, because they're so broad, so onerous, so expensive.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
your two airline policies and your Coles and Woolies, your two major grocers. Everyone thinks it's
Yep.
competition between Coles and Woolies, that they hate each other. Not at all. The ones that they hate are the independent grocers. They don't want any new entrants, because Coles and Woolies, they've got massive HR departments and they've got this massive infrastructure that they have to. And along comes
That's right.
a small independent grocer with much lower overheads, a lot less kind of, and that becomes a threat to the major grocer, and that's why they lobby politicians, Coles and Woolies, the big players. They lobby the
Yep.
politicians to bring in all sorts of regulations about, when they can open and how many square meters they can have that they need in order to open on a weekend, and all these rules and regulations to to force the smaller
The
players
competitors out of
to
business.
comply with the
Yeah.
regulations that they have to. And they're the bootleggers. And you remember a number of years ago when ANZET and TAA used to so-called, battle against each other, and along came, Compass Airlines and tried to, break into this duopoly. And wouldn't you know, lo and
Duopoly, yeah.
behold, the two major airlines joined forces to force them out. And of course, this is where the government kind of, acquiesces to the big players, um,
And
you know,
it's
big
all
Western
done with we need
campaign
to protect the
funding,
public from. Yes,
all
yeah,
that.
and it's
Yeah,
all done under the
there are
guise of
always
we
two
need to protect the
reasons.
public, and we
Yeah, when the government said there are always two reasons. There's the reason they tell you, and then there's the real reason. And
then
the
there's
real
the real
reason has
reason,
got a
yeah.
lot more to do with it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you must have just seen. I mean, you've been a long time in the what I call the viper's nest, and you must see this just every day. Like everything's
Every
the
day.
facade on the outside that's given to the public, and then there's what's really going on in the background.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah,
again, it's when you're in Parliament, everyone again seems to think that Liberal and Labor parties are like, two rival football teams in a town, and you've got, I mean, in South Australia,
yeah,
for
they hate each
example, we've
other.
got two teams. Well, they say they hate each other. We've got Port Power and the Adelaide Crows, for example, and they say they hate each other, and then their supporters hate each other. So they go to the game, and of course, this plays out, and we've got one group of supporters supposedly hating the other group of supporters. But that's not how it works at all. It's a bit
Yeah,
like the classic
no.
example
And then
is
after the
the
game, they're all
legal
at the pub
system is.
together having beers.
Look, the legal system's even a more stark example.
Oh,
Most people have
so
been in a courtroom and seen what it's like. You're having a dispute, and another litigant, and so you hire a lawyer, and then you also then get a barrister to argue your case. You go into the courtroom, and there you are, one end of the one side of the courtroom, and then you're the other litigant on the other side of the courtroom. You've got your lawyer at the instructing the barrister, and then up above is a judge, and you sort of think it's me against the other litigant. I've got my team, my lawyer, my barrister. He's got his lawyer, his barrister, and we're going before this judge. That's not how it works, because what happens as the days and weeks go by, they're arguing these little points at thousands of dollars an hour, and every now and then they stop the game, and you've got to throw money over the balustrade to keep the game going. And then you slowly realize you're actually getting closer and closer to the other litigant, until in the end, after a few weeks, you're sitting next to the person that's either you're suing or is suing you, and you nudge them and you say, you can see what's going on here.
yeah, this
They're
is a
just
sham.
taking us for a ride,
Yeah,
because we think
yep.
that there are two teams of one litigant, one with one team in front of a judge, but it's not. The two litigants are on one side, and all the lawyers and all the barristers and the judge are on the other side,
They're all in bed
and
together.
it's
Yeah,
you against them. And it dawns on you, you
yep.
think, we are being taken for a ride. It's not me and my team against you and your team. You and me are together. We're just funding this whole game. And the
I got to tell
political
you
thing is the
a
same.
funny
You sort of
story on the.
the supporters of Labor and
I've
Liberal, we think that we hate these Labor. You see them when they get together. They hate the voters. They get together and um,
yeah.
they'll work together to do anything to keep the vote. What they say about the voters is just disgraceful.
Grotesque.
And
Yeah.
but it's a charade, it's a game, and they've got everybody fooled, and they keep
I
the
testified.
public and the
I
voters in
I
the dark.
was. I testified. I was the expert
Go on.
witness testifying against Asada in a case against a football player a few years ago, and went into this. This was a tribunal, but it was very high end, with very, very well-known, respected, very well-paid individuals in the process, and I went to interrupt the barrister that I was being paid to, witness for, and he was chatting with the head of the tribunal about the barbecue that they were going to on the weekend and whether or not Jenny would be there. And you bring the kids, and you're just like, "Are you kidding me?" And the whole thing was just a rigged game, exactly as you said, right from the out. These guys were,
everywhere.
impartial, not even slightly. It was the whole thing was just a total have.
It's a charade.
So,
and it's everywhere. And of
well,
course,
given this,
the poor old public.
But given this, and given also the enormous bureaucratic infrastructure, not to mention like your Coles and your Woolies, who have put in place this huge HR infrastructure in this particular case, where do you even begin to dismantle it? What's the solution to this to come back to where we're actually free to, engage with whoever we want to employ or be employed by on the terms that we want for ourselves? How would you even start to get there?
You go back to the drilling the hole in the dike principle. I mean, once upon a time that the system was that the intellectuals came up with ideas and policies in universities and so on, and then that would filter out and disseminate around through politicians who would pick up these various ideas. But that's the political system has been so captured that doesn't work anymore. I've seen how really good ideas can they're so easily now squashed before they even take root. So you think, oh, how can a good idea, or how can an idea like freedom, how can that be practically applied? I remember when I first went into the building industry many, many years ago, and I started to notice how the disappearance of apprentices. When I started, every tradesman had a young apprentice working alongside him, every single one of them, didn't matter which trade it was. And I also noticed that the housing affordability and land prices were starting to rise. So I thought, this is no good. So I joined our industry association, and that's another story, industry associations and regulatory capture. But anyway, I joined the HIA and started to sort of, say, if you notice what's happening with apprentices and with housing affordability, and, what we need to do is this, the regulate. Of course, when you start talking like that, the first thing they do is make you the president and send you off to go lobbying and send you off to Canberra to go and lobby. So I thought, okay, so off I went and started to sort of talk to these politicians about what's happening with our industry and how housing affordability is getting out of control. And, if you don't own your own home by the time you retire, I tried to sort of, make it in their interest. I said, look, if people don't own their own home by the time they retire, you're going to have a major problem on your hands, because pensions are not going to be enough to either pay rent or pay a mortgage.
To cover rent.
So once upon a time, everybody, it was so easy to buy it. But anyway, when I started to explain to them what was going on, they didn't have a clue what I was talking about. None of them had ever had a proper job. They'd all been to university.
No, of course
they came out of university, got a job as a staffer.
Trained in Marxism.
Yep, or either work for a union or for an MP, and then they became the politician themselves. It was not
Yeah.
like in the old days when Bert Kelly and these others were around, where the party room was made up of people from real industries. So if someone came up with some harebrained idea in the party room and said, "I think we should do this or this," there was always someone in the party room that could put their hand up and say, "Hang on a minute, I used to work in the railway industry, or I worked on a farm. Let me tell you, if you do that, this will happen and that will happen." So they were
It'll
able
do
to
that.
nip these silly ideas. But now, of course, no one's worked anywhere. So all you get are Chris Bowen
No.
types now, and Anthony Albanese types that have never had a proper job. Anyway, so I thought these people they don't know what I'm talking about. So I thought the only way is to go in there and try and, do the thing myself and go and become an MP. And of course, I remember some of my industry colleagues said, Bob, mate, as George Carlin used
You're
to
out of your
say, it's a
mind.
club. It's a
Yeah,
club, and you ain't in it. And
Yep.
politics is designed to keep people like you out.
That's right.
So
More than
anyway,
ever.
I sort of.
Yeah.
So look, that's the problem. Is that it's the fact that there are people who don't know how the world really works. They're all porcupines. The fox and the porcupines. A porcupine knows how to do one thing: curl up and protect itself.
Yep.
Whereas a fox
Yep.
knows how to do a lot of things. And unfortunately, our governments are run by porcupines. The head of the police commissioner.
That's not a
down the
very
state.
inspirational message, though, Bob.
I'm sorry, but anyway, look how to go.
So
What to do. We've got
drill
to
the
try
hole
and
in the dam is
make
the
these small
answer, is it?
Drill a hole. Just go around drilling holes in dams and try to, you only need one
But that would seem
petrol
to.
station in a town to drop the price to force all the others. The argument is, oh well, most of the stations are doing this, or most of the land developers are housing. You only need one to drop the price, and that can bring all the others down. So drilling holes.
But that seems to be, from my perspective, part of the problem. I mean, I was around in leading up to the 2000s when the IT contractor thing was booming. And so everybody working in the IT industry was a private contractor. And for all intents and purposes, it looked like employment because they were with the same company doing the same thing at the same place at the same hours, 9 to 5 every day. And so the government came along and said, no, if it looks like a job and it works like a job, we couldn't give a goddamn about the contract that you voluntarily signed with the employer so that both of you had come to an agreement. You need to be under this onerous, mountain of regulation that we've already put into place. And then they've added to that since, where I had the problem of when I was trying to employ contractors in one of my businesses, and the rule was that they couldn't derive more than 80% of their income from the single source. They needed to be advertising to the market broadly, and they needed to be getting at least 20% from other sources. Except you as the employer had absolutely no right to ask for any evidence from the contractor that they were working with other people and advertising and getting more than 20% of their
But even
income
so,
from
what gives
other
them the right
sources.
to say? I mean,
And it then
if you're a
well, absolutely, but in terms of how it functioned from my point of view was that if they earned 81% from me or more, then they could go back 5 years and demand holiday pay, sick pay, and all the rest of and superannuation and all of the benefits on the contractor wage that I was paying them, which was at least triple what I would have paid them as employees. And so you're sitting there just going, I'm just sitting here waiting to be completely screwed. This is ridiculous. My understanding is it's gotten worse, that because of now with work cover and then the new laws that Labor's just put in place, it's even more. It seems that far from drilling holes in the dam, they're plugging the holes and then reinforcing them with sheet steel. So, who is actually working on this? Is there any sense that you get in politics at the moment? Because the Liberals clearly aren't, and Labor, I mean, they're the ones reinforcing the dam as much as they possibly can. They're yeah. How do we fix this problem?
Well, it'll just end up collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. We've
That was my answer too. It's not a good one though.
Private employment, union member. I mean, the gatekeepers, the union representatives. They'll they're on such a massive rent-seeking arrangement now, controlling the labour market. The unions control, the Labour Party. They own the Labour Party. They decide what they can and can't do. I remember that work choice. The work choices was back in those. That was a terrible thing that happened. I lobbied very heavily not to do that. To leave Peter Reith's old Workplace Relations Act alone. And don't try and mess around with it and create even more regulation to try and free up independent contractors. Don't do any of that. Just just leave it alone and just allow people to opt out. A one-sentence act of Parliament. Any contract of employment between a natural person and a corporation shall be lawful. Full stop. And then let people then it would eventually, that's the whole that would have, but John Howard and Kevin Andrews and all the others that all they knew was bureaucracy, and you can't just let people do their own thing. It set back the whole cause almost, for 50 years, I think. So eventually it will collapse. And there'll be so much, industry will be so expensive, no one will want to employ anyone. I mean, already, the number of people, employers, you say, there's no way I would ever employ somebody.
I was one of them.
I don't see anyone, because
to avoid
the unions and others, they know, these bootleggers know that if anyone, puts their head above the parapet and says, we want to fix this crazy workplace relations system, they'll just hit them overhead with work choices and then, and spread all sorts of, malicious and say, this guy, he'll have you down the mines for $1 a week if you keep going down this path. This go to extreme rhetoric, and no MP is going to be able to withstand that. None. I mean, I tried.
Okay,
David and I, on a number of occasions, we tried, but
it has to be fixed, but it won't be until something catastrophic happens. That's the bottom line.
Something catastrophic happens. Yeah.
You've said this ties in also then very much to housing, and you started to touch on that just a moment ago, and how that actually got you into this situation. So explain more your view on how this links in with housing, because housing is sort of the backbone of the Australian economy.
Well, it is, but it's also the backbone of the human being. I mean, I campaigned always at every family, a job and a house. I mean, basically, you think about it. If you've got a job and you own your own home, and plus you've got a little car in the driveway that will take you anywhere you want to go, anytime you want to go there, you basically don't need the government. You're self-sufficient. I'd
argue you don't anyway, but yes, I totally agree. That would, if there was no government, the three things that you would be seeking would be employment to get a house and a car, so that you're basically free to just live your life unaffected by others. Yeah,
exactly. And it's that should be everybody's right to be able to get a job, own their own home. Every man's home's his castle, as they say. Like the old,
which certainly should be a goal. It's
Magna Carta. Even the King of England can't cross his threshold without his permission.
Yeah. So though the winds and the rains may enter, the king's men cannot.
Exactly, that one. Yeah. Property rights. Rights to one's own labour and freedom of thought and freedom of movement. These things, the control freaks hate that. The whole world, they're regulators. They regulate more and more, and of course, then you've got the bootleggers, the ever-present rent-seeking, carpet-bagging bootleggers that look for opportunities to make money and lobby governments to bring in regulation to drip feed land for housing, so that they're the ones that are making the money, and of course the politicians. I mean, in Australia, the classic example. I used to, go to America and go to places like Texas where, they don't have any zoning or planning laws at all. You just go to the outskirts of the suburbs, and a ranch can just start subdividing without any approvals from anybody, and start building a township and a suburbs. And once it's done, or at a certain stage, they can then attach it to a local, municipal council area or something. Going to Texas is great fun. If you've ever been there, especially if you're in those kind of industries that I was in the housing industry, they look after you really well. The first thing they do is take you out at night and they take you to a bar. And of course, when you go in there, they frisk you to see if you've got any guns. And if you haven't got one, they give you one. That.
I was going to say, yeah, and then they give you one if you haven't got one. Yeah. Yeah. This is too small. You're not allowed. Here's something bigger. Yeah.
I mean,
here's a desert eagle.
When the GFC happened, the housing mortgage crisis, the prime subprime mortgage crisis happened in America. It caused massive problems everywhere except in Texas. And also to a lesser extent and in Georgia, but in Texas, because they didn't have planning laws and regulation that prevented, supply and demand, or supply to meet demand. So as that demand for housing increased, then they just, more land was built
more
and
houses.
They'd say, how come you've got a problem in Australia? And I said, oh, well, we got a land shortage.
Yeah.
And they say, we've got a land shortage in Australia. And I say, well, actually, it's not so much land
it's
shortage.
It's a ridiculous notion.
Well, then even more ridiculous. Then they say, no, it's not. We got a shortage of land. It's that it hasn't been released. And they just can't get that. What do you mean released? Is it a wild animal you have to release? They don't understand how can you release land. I mean, does the land run away? If you release, it doesn't make sense to them.
That's right.
So, well, it's actually tied up with zoning. So you've got these urban growth boundaries around our capital cities, and you can build on this side of the line, but not on the other. And of course, that creates all sorts of distortions and opportunities, corruption, because on one side of the line, of the zoning line, the land's worth $1,000 an acre, broad acre farmland. And on the other side of the line, it's worth $1 million an acre. You sort of think, people trying to get their land rezoned, and obviously they will then bribe and cajole and find ways of funding political parties to then rezone their land. You shouldn't have that kind of zoning. There should be no difference in value between land for farming and land for housing. It should just become a natural supply and demand kind of, demarcation. But so you got that factor. The Baptists and bootleggers kicks into the housing, and that's what happens there. So we've now got a situation where the entry level, and
Bob,
to me, everything's about
Sorry, but going back to that, what incentive is there for the government not to release the land? I don't quite understand what you mean by that.
The government doesn't, because they're making the most money out of it. They have land commissions and land trusts, and they are they're players themselves. They're joint venturers. They own land. They release land. It's in their interest.
They want to sell the land off at the highest possible price.
Yep, and stamp duty. They see how much money they make from high land prices.
Stamp duty makes sense. Yeah.
And I said to a government minister once, a Liberal minister, I said, "Look, when you were in office, why didn't you release more land?" And he said, "Well, we needed the money." And I said, "Yeah, but what about the first home buyers?"
That's another one of these. Doesn't this work like the Laffer curve, where sure, a little bit more tax brings in a little bit more money to a certain point, at which actually it starts going backwards again, and you would just go, surely if you just released the land, at 3 times, it's not like there's a shortage, as we've said, but if you release the land at 3 times the rate, maybe you don't get the full price that you're getting right now, but there's 3 times more land being sold off. So surely the actual balance of payments would wind up in your favor in a country like Australia, where it's sort of like you've got such an abundance.
Yeah, not only are they land players themselves, the bootleggers, the land developers are very sophisticated in their lobbying efforts and campaign funding strategies. They know how to control the supply of land to maximize the price, and of course, stamp duty, the amount of money that they make from high prices of property. So it's, I mean, even John Howard used to say, I don't get anyone stopping me in the street complaining that the price of their house is going up. So there was a political incentive for them as well. And all it did was, raise that first rung on the ladder, which has been I don't care if, in a flash suburbs, where the average price is, $1 or $2 million, so long as the entry point is no more than 3 times income.
Affordable.
It's the same with employment. I don't care if the head of a corporation gets $10 million, so long as someone getting a start in the job market can get their first rung on the ladder at whatever that suits them. That is my number one. That's my beef always, is that entry point. Starting a business, I don't care how much money the big businesses make, so long as someone wanting to start a business can get their first rung on the ladder and not have to be bombarded with all the regulations that the big ones have to comply with.
And then that just makes so much sense, doesn't it? I mean, in terms of, it kind of answers everybody's issue, I would have thought. But from those who apparently are, all worried about the poor and all the rest of it, that want to put all of these regulations in place that don't seem to work.
Well, they say they're worried about.
Like, you've answered that question. This is. That's right. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, what their motivations are truly is another discussion. So then,
exactly.
Again, how does this get fixed? Where do you drill the hole in this particular dam to get the land released so that we can get a move on in a positive direction for society?
Well, all you can do is keep chipping away. Every bit helps. Letters to the editor. I wrote another one today. I mean, all you can do is just keep putting it out there. I've been, banging this drum now for more than 20 years. Everybody knows that this is true and right. And now, of course, home buyers, but there are so many people now that are on the property bandwagon. I've even said to people, how much did you pay for your house? And they'll say $300,000. And I say, what's it worth now? And they say it's worth $1 million.
Yeah, $1 million.
And I said, well, look, you've made $700,000 for while you sleep. It's causing a major problem for first home buyers. Would you be prepared to allow the value of your house to drop a little bit in order for first home buyers to get into the market? And they say, no way. So you've got people now that, they're on the...
But
I'm all right.
There's not even realistically, there's not even a reason for that to happen, is it? It's still the land in the inner cities, which is the highest priced and most demanded, is going to sit where it is. Yeah. Because the fact that they go and they release some rural land...
You've got to get them to vote, because they're the ones that, they're targeted with the scare campaign. If you listen to Bob Day and his policy, can you afford the value of your house to go down by $400,000? What are you going to do, with your mortgage payment? Can you bridge that gap there? The margin call on your mortgage. Can you afford? They will make up and demonize and completely exaggerate out of all proportion what you're trying to do. Even if you sort of, at some points along the kind of spectrum from inner suburb to outer suburb, I mean, I say to these people that are in inner suburban $1 million houses, how cheap would housing have to be for you to go out and live out at Gawler or Elizabeth or out there? And they say, you could give it away and I wouldn't go and live there. No. And I said, well, that's my point.
That's right.
It's not going to affect you that much. But even if it did, the way that they win arguments against reformers is not with facts and logic and the truth. It's by,
No,
complete
emotion.
distortion and
Yeah.
exaggeration. And people then shrug their
Well,
shoulders and think, oh, well, I'm doing all right. I can't risk it. And they say, can you afford to,
it's
for your wages to drop by half, because that's what will happen if you listen to this bloke. And can you afford the value of your house to drop by half? Because that's what will happen if you listen to this bloke. And they just go on like this until in the end, no one will vote for you, and no one's going to champion the law change in the parliament, because it's too easy for them at the moment. They're on their $250,000 a year as a backbencher. As the minister's not going to do it. No backbencher is going to stand up and give a speech about the need to change the housing or employment laws or small business laws, because they know what's going to come if they try.
But what about the?
Anyway, that doesn't.
I mean, we've had interest rates at record low level, like historically record low levels for 15 years, essentially, the better part of.
Yeah.
That's obviously not sustainable. Interest rates are inevitably going to go back to where they traditionally would be and where there is a fair return on money, in which case housing prices, you would think, are in a lot of trouble, because the only reason that the average price is $1 million is because the average person on $100,000 salary can borrow $1.5 million. So that $400,000 that they're going to lose on their property is more likely to be taken away because of the interest rate increases than it is because a few parcels of land are going to be released. What are they going to do when this happens anyway? Because
exactly. I mean, I say to people, because then they say, interest rates used to be 10 and 12 and 15%. And I said, would you rather I said, how much is your mortgage at the moment? And they'll say, $600,000. I said, what would you rather have? A $300,000 mortgage and interest rates at 12%, 15%, or $600,000 mortgage at 6%, and $300,000 mortgage. So they'd much rather a lower mortgage rather than a lower interest rate, because debt is a lot more onerous than interest rate. Interest rates come and go, and at least you can pay off a $300,000 home loan, but a $600,000, you are at the mercy of the interest rates.
Absolutely, and there are millions of Australians in that position.
It doesn't need to be like that. It never, for 100 years, exactly 100, from 1900 right through to the year 2000, the median house price was exactly 3 times the median income for 100 years. And then they introduced,
and now it's 10
planning laws and restrictions and regulations, and supply was no longer able to meet demand. And all this talk about, we had high immigration and interest rates dropped and there was negative gearing and capital gains tax concession. It had nothing to do with it. I mean, at exactly that time,
yes,
nothing to do with it. Because exactly at that time, high-tech goods, plasma TVs and digital TVs and laptops and iPhones and computer, all sorts of things were coming on the market. I bought my first digital TV 20 years ago, and it cost $8,000 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Now that same one now is 10 times better, and it costs $800. Because even though there was a massive increase in demand for all these goods, the price dropped because supply was able to meet the demand. And whereas in housing, we had a sudden surge in demand, and I acknowledge that, but supply was not allowed to keep up with the demand. They restricted the amount of land. There were plenty of builders around that could, ready, willing, and able
could have built it,
any number of houses on this land. But the land restrictions was prevented the demand being met, and so prices went up.
And I think about how that would follow through too. It's like
the market, when you interfere with the market, that's
Australia.
what
and now Australia has 250,000 qualified personal trainers and another million qualified HR and DEI experts. It's only got 150,000 qualified builders, and and the price of building costs $1 million to put up a small shed.
Yeah.
It's distorted the market
when,
everywhere.
People, it's like the Hayek and the von Mises, they were spot on. They don't understand how a free market works. Let people decide for themselves what they want to pay for something, and stop trying to regulate. And you multiply that right across our entire state. South Australia, the state that I live in, was once one of the leading states in the Commonwealth. We were the number 3. Adelaide was the number 3 city in Australia, bigger than Perth, bigger than Brisbane. And we had 20 of the top 100 companies in Australia had their headquarters in Adelaide. News Corp, Faldings,
wow.
South Corp, Adelaide, Brighton Cement, a whole lot of companies were headquartered in Adelaide. We've only got one left. That's Santos, and that's because of some special deal that kind of almost prevents them from leaving. But South Australia was a powerhouse of manufacturing and all sorts of things. Because we had a leader, Tom Playford, his name was the Premier. And he said, look, we're going to be competitive. We had cheap power, we had cheap water, we had cheap land, and wages were lower, even though, again, like Lobethal, wages were lower, but the standard of living and the quality of life in Adelaide was much higher than Melbourne and Sydney. So we had this much more competitive regime in South Australia, and the state thrived. And, that all went by the wayside, and now we've got the highest power prices in Australia, some of the highest power prices in the world. Our wages are on a par with Melbourne and Sydney, so why would they set up here, away from all the manufacturing bases on the eastern seaboard? Our land, thanks to all the regulation, is now ridiculously expensive, and water, of course, as well. No longer do we have cheap water. So all our competitive advantages have gone by the wayside, and now we're a mendicant state, along with Tasmania.
They're still there. They've just been ruined by bad politics and bad policy.
And we would now rely on Commonwealth grants transfers. The Commonwealth Grants Commission. We rely on other states to subsidise South Australia. When I was in Parliament, I lost count of the number of times people would say, do you think South Australia will ever be able to stand on its own 2 feet again? They used to really knock me. I said, of course we could. We did once before, and we could again if we're allowed to. But we're a mendicant state. Now we've thrown out a whole lot into renewable energy, and our government at the moment is now going after and chasing green hydrogen. It's all going to end in tears again, like it did, 30 years ago with our state bank collapse, when they went chasing boondoggles and, all over the world. Ends in tears. You've got people that don't understand what they're doing, and they're gambling with taxpayers' money, and it always ends.
That's a good segue into my last question for you, Bob, which was, and it ties into what I was talking to Jim Wilmot about in my last episode, which you haven't seen yet. But how much of this is coming from international sources? Because obviously the entire green, renewable, sustainability agenda is all imported, and I'm wondering how much you've seen, being that you have been in the Senate, you've seen the conversations firsthand up close. How much is being imported from whoever is coming up with these terrible ideas overseas, and what are the incentives that are being provided to the politicians to follow these crazy policies, or is it all just organic and just bad policy by stupid people?
Oh no, this is the greatest Baptists and bootleggers, rent-seeking racket that's ever been invented, is renewable energy. Everybody knows that it's just not economic. It only relies entirely on massive subsidies. So
It's not
you've got
real.
a renewable energy industry, which is funding, you know, political campaigns and funding environmental movements to keep the game going. I mean, David Lionhelm and I were chair and deputy chair of the wind turbines inquiry, and we travelled all over Australia looking at these wind turbines and the rorting and the racket. I mean, each one costs $1.5 million each, I think, to build, and gets a $500,000 subsidy the moment it's finished. So there's a guarantee that no matter how many you build, you'll get an immediate guaranteed $500,000 a year check from the government, whether the blades spin or not. And
You're
so
joking.
you know, absolutely. So you've now got this massive renewable energy. It's a bit like if you had a shop and then someone opened the shop next door and
They
a law was
guaranteed you
passed
customers.
that guaranteed all the customers first had to go and buy next door, and only when he couldn't open could he come and shop in your store. And you're the coal industry or the gas industry or whatever it is that's been going.
Nuclear
And so
industry.
fine when he's got goods on his shelves, that's fine. But what happens when he runs out, when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining? They say, well, you can go and buy energy next door. And the guy next door thinks, well, you know, why should I only have to
No.
sell the second fiddle? So no one, and now they're blaming the coal shop for closing up and saying, I mean, you know, Chris Bowen the other day, oh, it's a failure from the coal-fired power plants are letting the side down. Well, they said, hang on a minute, you're the one that drove them out of business. You set up a shop next door selling something else, which people had to buy. It was compulsory.
Yes, which,
You had to buy from them first. And of course, you know, this is why once upon, you know, when I was a public servant, you know, every department back then was headed by an engineer. So that even the, you know, the social kind of departments were run by engineers because they applied logic. But now, of course, that none of them are run by engineers. They're all run by, you know, political hacks who just do what the minister says. So none of this stacks up, you know, engineering wise or economic wise at all. So it's all going to collapse, and it's just going to be a massive. One day, someone write a book. They'll write a book, and the book will be called 50 Years of Madness. 50 Years of Madness, how the whole world was conned by the whole renewable energy industry. And now we've got all these wind towers, like, you know, we'll be all like Don Quixote going around tilting at these windmills because they're not, you know, they're not turning, and they're all rusted.
But sorry, you said there's the government underwrite, meaning the taxpayer is underwriting $500,000 per year in payment for whatever power every wind turbine.
Correct.
But these things last for 20 years. So you put in $1.5 million to put up a wind turbine on your farm, which is what I spoke to Jim about, and you're guaranteed $10 million in revenue over the course of the next 20 years in return. That's the most, a 33% return on investment immediately every year.
That's the wind farm company, not the property owner. The property owner gets like, I don't know, 50 grand a year. The wind farm companies get this $500,000 a year guaranteed income. Yep. It's massive.
So this is like this is a chain of hairdressing salons that opens up, and the government underwrites the amount of money per salon that they get right off
hair or no hair.
And before you cut any hair, and in fact it's more money than any hairdressing salon could ever generate by itself, because a wind turbine can't generate $500,000 worth of electricity in a year. That's impossible. Am I wrong?
But you're saving the planet, Damon. You're saving the planet.
Well, that's true, and that's worth at least $499,000, I suppose, per year per wind turbine.
Yeah.
Right.
You should have a chat to David about it as well. I mean, you know, he was chair of the committee,
I plan
the inquiry.
Okay,
Yeah, we
well, I'll
wrote a
definitely go
report
into
about
more
it.
depth with him.
There's a report. There's a report on the. I can send it to you if you like, with all the details and facts and
Yeah,
figures.
please.
It's really interesting.
That's just
It's the biggest racket ever invented. I mean, the old bootleggers, the Al Capone and the bootleggers from the 20s
had nothing on
would
these
turn in their
guys.
graves if they
Yeah.
saw how well their idea has developed.
Well, on that really depressing note, I should thank you. So we're all screwed, and we just need to wait for it all to collapse before we can actually go back to voluntary association and afford to buy a house at a reasonable price again.
Maybe on a more positive. We could always do like, what's his name, Jomberg, the Copenhagen consensus guy. He says, look, because he got all these economists and scientists together and in Copenhagen a few years ago and said, look, if we could only fix one problem, and I often use this talking to companies or organizations, look, if you could only fix one problem in the world and get the most benefit for the most people at the least cost, what would that one thing be? And they all said, well, that's easy, disease, we could save more lives, and for, relatively low cost, we could, do this, have millions of lives. And he said, oh, okay, well, that was easy. Well, look, if we could solve two problems in the world and get the most benefit for the most people at the lowest cost, what two things? And he said, well, that's easy. Malnutrition. There's enough food in the world to feed everyone 10 times over, really. It's just a distribution problem, and we could easily do it. Okay, well, what about three? If we could do three things. And they said, oh, well, that's easy as well, clean water. And it went down this, so they formed this list. So they went, malnutrition, disease, clean water, trade barriers, sanitation, all these sorts of things. So often if you say, okay, well, look, we can't fix all these problems, but if we could fix one thing in Australia, just one, and have the most benefit for the most people, what would that one thing be? I would say straight away, it would be employment, job, freedom, free to work. And if you could do two, well, and then a home of your own. What about three? Well, then you could start a business. These kind of things at least try and simplify, what is the best approach? How do you tackle all these problems? You can't tackle them all at once. You can do them one at a time, or if you really could do two, what would they be?
And really, the easy answer to all of these things is that the solution to all of them would be deregulation. It's just, of course. It's not that there aren't people who want to hire good people to do a job and good people who want to do a good job for a bit. It's not that these two things don't exist. It's not that people don't want. It comes back to the libertarian concept of voluntary association. It's like you've got two parties that want to work together, and it's only the government that's saying no, you're not allowed to, and get them out of the way.
We've got to convince people,
and things will be all right.
We've got to convince people that the government is not your friend. The government has got quite a high kind of kudos or brand kind of value. But when you say government, you're talking about politicians and public servant bureaucrats and regulators. That is government. And let me tell you, I've met them all. Yeah. I've been a politician and a public servant. I can tell you, they are no smarter than you. And they don't know or understand how the world works like you do. Don't let these politicians and public sector bureaucrats and regulators tell you how to live. They will ruin your life. Anyway.
Amen to that.
That's my two.
Amen to that.
Okay, there's my two bobs.
That's the perfect message to end on. And that's the libertarian message in a nutshell. Yeah, let's get these people out of our lives. Mr. Bob Day, thank you very much for your time. It's really been an honour and a pleasure, sir. So I look forward to speaking to you again soon on another episode.
Likewise. Tony Damon.